Apple, it's time for you to comply. Good morning! Yes. Good morning, Tim. It's time for you to comply with the DMA. Yes, I understand. We have so many new changes and upgrades we're excited to announce for the Apple App Store. Now, you need to make sure that third parties can install their own app stores and they can link people to other third-party payment systems, and people have to be able to— Yeah, I know what you're saying, but it's just, we want people to go through our app store for safety reasons. Tim, we've talked about this. This is the law. You are required to allow third-party app stores now. We will enable third-party app stores. Thank you. For a fee. No, why is this so hard for you to understand? Don't worry about it, okay? We're going to lower the fee that we charge our developers in the European Union. But there is a new core technology fee that's basically gonna cost people about €1 a month for every 2 downloads. Downloads? So it's not based on how much revenue they generate? No, this will apply to free apps as well. Tim, that means you could bankrupt a company that just releases a free app if it goes viral. Have you heard of spatial computing? It's where we're all headed. It's going to change the world. Tim, you know, the cameras can actually see my fingers when they're down here. I don't have to hold them up like this. Wow. The EU wants to tell big tech companies how to run themselves all the time, and we've seen some of the effects of that. Most recently, I think, with the USB-C mandate on the iPhones. You can kind of tell when Apple's willing to comply a little bit more benevolently, because there was a long time where a lot of people were saying, just because the European Union says the iPhone has to have Type-C, that doesn't mean they're actually gonna do it. So many people were arguing with me about how, oh no, they don't really have to have it, they'll just go portless, or no, they're gonna come up with some rule where you just have to charge the iPhone via Type-C at the wall brick, but they can still keep Lightning on the iPhone. Or I even remember people saying, no, they're just gonna switch the iPhone to Type-C in Europe, but not overseas. And I argued with so many of you saying that no, that USB-C is just an inherent advantage. There's probably a huge chunk of engineers at the company that want to switch to USB-C anyway. It's gonna be too complicated engineering-wise to manufacture iPhones with Lightning and Type-C, and so many of you doubted me, and yet here we are. I'm using a USB-C iPhone 15 right now against what so many people had predicted, and I think Apple was willing to comply because they knew at the end of the day, it's not really that bad of an idea. Marketing-wise, you can make the iPhone a lot better via Type-C, and that helps them sell more iPhones, which helps them make more money. And at the end of the day, Apple is a company. They are going to focus on what brings them the most amount of money, and that kind of shows their approach towards the Digital Markets Act, which the European Union is putting into effect pretty quickly here, and Apple is, by all technicality, complying with a lot of these requirements, including allowing other web browsers on the iPhone, also allowing third-party stores, basically side-loading, and allowing devs to put third-party payment systems in place. Apple somehow found a way to comply with all of these rules while simultaneously punching all of these developers that try to agree to the new terms directly in the face, in the gut, in the groin. You know, they're just beating them to death here because of these new core technology fees, as well as saying that, okay, yeah, we're going to allow third-party app stores on the iPhone. However, you need to prove that you're bringing in over $1 million in revenue, and Apple still wants to actually be able to review all of the apps that you start putting in those third-party app stores, which, yes, as soon as I read that, like most of you, I was pretty much like, doesn't that defeat the whole point of the third-party app store? But I think the real kicker at the end of the day is this core technology fee, because this is not a percentage argument anymore, which is what we used to be having. Like, people were upset that Apple was charging 30% of all the processing fees, and Apple had too much control over what goes on the iPhone, and some people would argue it should be 10%, and some people would argue it should be 15%. Apple basically said that most developers are gonna pay a lower fee now, because if you generate less than $1 million a year of revenue, then you do get a lower fee. But the real one that I think is just abundantly ridiculous, that there's no denying Apple is intentionally delaying the inevitable. Like, this new approach that they have with the core technology fee being €0.5 per download after 1 million downloads, that's clearly them knowing they're gonna tick off the European Union, knowing they're gonna tick off most developers. And of course, even with the big companies like Epic Games, they're promising that Fortnite is coming back to iOS, but if they have to pay €1 for every 2 people that download the game, yeah, I'm sorry, there's absolutely no way that's going to be profitable for them. Either Epic didn't read the fine print, which is part of the reason they're banned. It's not so much that they were wrong for the concept of putting a third-party payment system into their app. It was that they knowingly did it after agreeing to a contract saying they wouldn't. That's why they were banned. And apparently Apple can still manually review apps that are put through the third-party app stores. So there's still technically a chance that Apple could ban Fortnite again. That's what we call in the legal world a pro-gamer move. But that core technology fee essentially would result in free apps that go viral, costing the developer hundreds of thousands of dollars on a monthly basis, which of course a lot of devs are not going to be able to afford. And that's kind of Apple's guaranteed way of making sure that no one who actually reads the terms and conditions for these new laws becoming available to comply to the Digital Markets Act is actually going to agree with it. And I feel like Apple can't be that stupid, right? They know that this doesn't really achieve the intention of the Digital Markets Act. They know this is going to tick off the European Union and basically result in no changes, but Apple's just getting a little bit picky with the wording of all of these laws, saying, oh, we found a loophole here, we found a loophole here. Left and right, they found every possible loophole they could to ensure that no one would really actually enjoy these new laws and these new terms and conditions, and assume that the vast majority of developers are just going to stick with the old-fashioned terms and conditions. That way Apple can continue taking their 30% fee and continue having complete control of everything that goes on the App Store. So of course the European Union is probably going to have to go after Apple after this, and Apple probably knows that. So what I essentially think it is Apple kind of dragging their feet on this whole process. To me, it looks like they kind of know they've lost, so they're delaying the inevitable. I don't think there's any way where the EU just does nothing and says, okay, Digital Markets Act, it's accomplished its goal, when Apple has made things so much worse for the developer in this way. But Apple knows it's going to take time for European Union to come up with another draft and have to reword all of the laws and make sure that there's no way for Apple to come up with any loopholes. And Apple probably knows that because the European Union has to move somewhat slowly, it's a bunch of governments and a bunch of countries all working together. Apple's like, we'd rather take that 30% fee and maintain as much control over the App Store as long as possible so that we generate the vast majority of revenue, and then eventually they will lose here. If a government wants something, it may take them a while to actually get the bill and the law all passed and worded correctly, but they will get it. And there's a lot of politicians out there, I'm sure, that have nothing else better to do than to go after the big tech companies. And I've seen people on both sides of the argument whether or not the Digital Markets Act is fair and should Apple be fighting it as much as possible. I think it's kind of pointless at this point, personally. Like, we can argue all day whether or not we think a government should have control over Apple's App Store. I personally don't think it's a monopoly. I feel like saying that Apple has a monopoly on the iOS App Store is kind of like saying Netflix has a monopoly on Netflix or Disney Plus has a monopoly on Disney content, especially when iPhones are not the majority of smartphones in the world. I don't really think it should count. It's the same definition of like a monopoly that needs to be broken up, but it doesn't really matter so much what I think. If a government voted on this and agreed that they're going to enforce this in their countries, I think, okay, you may not agree with the law, but you kind of have to comply to it. And I think this is kind of petty. Like, seriously, how much money is Apple really going to generate in the amount of time it takes for EU to fight all of these changes Apple has made in order to basically comply with the Digital Markets Act? Apple's kind of acting like a little kid. They're like holding their finger in front of their little brother saying, see, I'm not touching him, technically. You told me not to touch him, so I'm not doing it. Like, obviously this isn't going to last, and I don't think that the majority of Apple's revenue is really going to be that much better or worse because of the Digital Market Act. Like, I still think a ton of people are still gonna stick with whatever's on the iOS App Store. And sure, people are probably going to use some third-party payment services now, but how much is really Apple going to lose by having people not go through Apple Pay? Like, yeah, I could see a few $100 million here and there over the long term, but Apple, I think you should just take the L, just accept that the law has passed. You're not gonna overturn this law just by being malicious with your compliance with it. But do I wish that all of these changes from the Digital Markets Act would also come to the United States? Not particularly. I do think that there's a lot of bad that could come from companies starting to figure out that they could generate a little bit more revenue if they had their own separate app store. And like I've said before, I don't think that sideloading or third-party app stores are inherently a bad thing. It's just dependent on how it's implemented. And I've said from the beginning, we don't know how Apple is going to implement it. So if they make it so simple and so easy to sideload that all it really takes is you tapping some link within a browser to install third-party software that is not verified by Apple, yeah, I could totally see the malicious links out there, you know, older people that don't really know what they're doing on their iPhone, clicking links and installing apps that could do dangerous things or could impede on your privacy of the iPhone. I do kind of support the free market to decide, like, what companies want to do. You know, if Google wants to allow sideloading in third-party stores on their hardware, I think they should be free to do so, and if Apple doesn't want to do it and you're upset about that, then okay, don't support Apple, don't buy their hardware. That's where I fall on the subject. Like, if you don't want Apple having so much control over your phone, don't buy a phone from Apple. And trying to turn this into a whole, well, I have to buy an iPhone, there's no choice, I am required to buy this platform. Nah, sorry, that argument doesn't really work for me. Mainly because I've been so impressed by so many great Android phones out there. They're not necessarily the phone I choose to put in my pocket on a daily basis, but yeah, there's so much more control and freedom you have over on Android, and there's amazing Pixel hardware that I was very tempted to switch to. Samsung makes some incredible stuff as well, and countless other smaller Android companies that will give you more control over your phone. Like, if you really want more repairability and far more control over your operating system and stuff, I would recommend checking out the Fairphone, a company that's built from the ground up by sustainability and modularity and being able to service everything yourself. You should vote with your wallet. If that's what you want to see more of out of a company, then buy products that actually support what you're interested in. If the company you're buying from, like Apple, doesn't want to support the things you care about, then I don't think the solution is ask for the government to force that company to do what you want, because that's how we result in less diversity in the smartphone market. If the government starts cracking down on what every single phone and what every single app store has to support and not support, then there's not going to be a varying range of takes and interpretations on how a smartphone should be. Apple has one interpretation. A lot of you may think it's a bad one, like how dare Apple assume only apps from the App Store should be installed, or how dare Apple assume there should be a 30% fee. If you don't like that concept, don't support it, you know? But Europe is a bit more of a fast-moving government and has a little bit less of that, you know, freedom concept that we have in the US government, which is by no means perfect. Don't get me started on that. But for better or for worse, the country is kind of founded on that individualism, that supporting of freedom idea, and I think that's why this country probably won't get too much like the Digital Markets Act, but other countries might follow in the EU's footsteps. But now other countries hopefully will take notes as to how Apple can maliciously comply to these new terms and conditions and make it basically impossible for free apps to exist or for developers to release apps without Apple's oversight over how they work and can they really run on the iPhone. But Apple's gonna lose. I try to remind people of that every time. There's no way they're gonna win over the EU just by being so technical with all of their wording. EU wants something, they're gonna get it, and I think Apple would be a lot more respectful and probably have a much better look overall as a brand if they just pleasantly and benevolently complied to the rules. Like, okay, we're gonna try to make third-party stores and sideloading apps as safe and as reliable as possible without tacking on massive core technology fees. In the same way that I love the way they complied with the USB-C mandate. They did it a year early, by the way. They didn't technically have to switch the iPhone to USB-C until this year, but they did it last year, and they came up with a lot of advantages for it. They were like, hey, on the 15 Pro, now you'll get much faster data transfer speeds than you ever got with Lightning, and now you can charge other iPhones, and you can use one cable to charge your MacBook, your iPad, and your iPhone. Yes, thank you, Apple. Let's just lean into the advantages, even though, sure, you probably lost out on some made-for-iPhone Lightning revenue. You didn't dwell on that, right? Like, they didn't put out a newsroom post that says the iPhone is switching to USB-C to comply with this inferior, poorly worded EU law. No, they just leaned into the advantages and did it in a classy way, and we were just like, all right, Apple, maybe the decision wasn't entirely yours, but we're grateful that you made it anyway. Now we're reaping the benefits from it. I think there was a classier, nicer way for them to comply while simultaneously not allowing those things outside of the EU. Of course, Apple wants to have their control, and software features are much, much easier to restrict on a per-country basis. So there was no doubt in my mind that they were going to restrict all of this stuff to the European Union. But what do you guys think of Apple's approach? Do you think they should fight it tooth and nail as much as they possibly can? Or do you think these are good changes because Apple's getting pretty dang profitable and has quite a lot of control over what apps are and aren't allowed on the iPhone? Do you think they should be forced to allow more alternative app stores and more third-party apps that Apple doesn't get to see what happens in? I would say the biggest win of the whole thing is that we're finally getting game streaming apps enabled on the App Store. That's pretty cool. A lot of people wanted that, and there was this big debate on whether or not Apple should allow it. At least with the Digital Markets Act, they seem to enable that now, so we should be able to play, like, Xbox games on our iPhone just via streaming. I don't think that really hurts all that much. Those games were never gonna come to the iPhone anyway, right? All that good stuff. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you all in the next one.